Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm here today with Libby Murdoch, who's a specialist in brain-based interventions for people with trauma and other kinds of brain challenges. And I'm so excited to talk to her because she's very focused on solutions, and I love to hear that. So, hi, Libby.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I've been following your work for such a long time, and it has really been eye-opening for me.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you. So, I hear you have a question for me. So, what's that?
Yes, so I work a lot with individuals who have experienced trauma, both childhood and then adult incident traumas. And I know you talk about brain change. One of my favorite quotes that you say is like, if you're willing to kind of be uncomfortable for a short while, you can create lasting brain change. So you also mentioned that that can be scary or even dangerous feeling. So how can I help people who have had trauma to start to build those positive pathways when leaving that comfort zone feels super scary and sometimes even dangerous?
Okay, great question. So, the simplest answer that you would probably think of too is very small steps repeated a lot. Okay, so small steps repeated a lot. So if we want to, and when we say small steps, we're focusing always on what we want rather than what we don't want. And as you know, of course, for the person who thinks that doing what they want is scary, if you take a small step of what you want and then realize that it doesn't kill you, and then you repeat it, then you're teaching your brain that it's safe to do X, whatever X is. So X could be, let's just use a familiar example of putting yourself out socially. Okay,
Yes.
so average person would think, oh my God, I feel like I'm going to die when I put myself out socially. And as we know, socially can include also in the workplace arena. So what would be a really tiny step that a person can do toward putting themselves out socially? So depending on where a person is, a really tiny step would be just making eye contact. Because how often do we know that just when you make eye contact, you feel uncomfortable and then it triggers the whole circuit that you have of they don't respect me, they don't like me, they're going to ignore me, nobody's going to love me, and I'm going to end up in a van down by the river. So what I talk about, I even practice making eye contact with supermarket clerks to
Okay.
just get the bad feelings out of the way in a context where it doesn't count. And then if the supermarket clerk doesn't smile back at me, then I say, oh, of course, because that person is spending the whole day doing that. And some people don't smile back at them. So they learn to protect themselves by not making eye contact with you. And then you just see that everybody else is human and they're not just there judging you. So just a thought.
Okay. I like that because that's something, that's simple, it's measurable, it's realistic, it's time sensitive. You could say, between now and next session, can you just make eye contact and even smile, maybe give a wave to people that you pass on the street, to the person at the store, those small little interactions that can kind of build up over time.
Yeah. And then when you're doing it and having a reaction to doing it, to notice your own reaction and remind yourself that that reaction is caused by your old neural pathways. You don't have to judge them or criticize them or hate them or feel like your neural pathways are less good than someone else, but just to have acceptance for your inner mammal and say, slowly over time, I can make slight adjustments to my neural pathways, but for now, I'm just going to accept them.
I love that too, because it really connects with what we know about trauma and how trauma can literally color the lens. Like you, as someone who've experienced a traumatic experience before, your brain having that adaptive survival thing, it's like, ooh, I'm never going to let this happen to you again. So when you've had a traumatic experience, you may come into a completely neutral experience, but your brain's sending you that signal that says this isn't safe. And so to be aware of that, to acknowledge that, and to simplify it as what it actually is, which is those old neural pathways.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So the reason I'm so happy to talk to you is because I run into a lot of people who speak of this concept of a trauma lens. And in my experience, it's not necessarily useful to people because they learn to see themselves as broken or flawed. They get the impression that other people are happy effortlessly and happy chemicals just flow all the time for no reason in other people, and I am somehow broken, and that becomes their identity. And then they fight for their victimhood agenda instead of working to make themselves feel better, which is the challenge that every one of us has. And so I was very pleased when I heard from you, because you really didn't sound like you were approaching it in that way at all. And since I know that so many listeners have been what I would call like seduced by the concept that you've been traumatized, rather than saying that every brain is just a recording of everything bad that ever happened to you, which is what all of our brains do. And we could have a victim Olympics, and I could say, yes, but my painful past is more painful than your painful past. But instead, I just like to go right to the, what can you do about it? And you have so many great ideas that first I want to tell listeners that if you can't get all of this information all at once, that Libby Murdoch has a practice called Brain-Based Counseling and Consulting, and you can find her on Facebook at Brain-Based Counseling and Consulting. And she's also happy to correspond with you as needs be and to give you information. And she does individual sessions that are both in person in North Carolina and online. So, Libby, thank you. Do you want to maybe just to give people, before going into detail of any of them, just give like a sort of an overview of what would be some of the various interventions that in your experience have worked for people with trauma background, or who identify with the trauma lens?
Yes, definitely. And I want to dive into that, but I want to touch on a couple of things you said first, because for me, the brain science is what actually blew through that whole lens of I'm broken. So when you begin to understand how the brain works, you understand that because we're designed to survive, our brain is actually designed to be shaped by and for the environment, relationships, and experiences that we have. So in effect, none of us are broken. We're all affected. And that's exactly how our brain was designed. So we're not broken at all.
Yes.
In fact, our brain is responding normally to abnormal survival scenarios. Mm-hmm. So I love that you said that, because that is one of the first things that I like to teach people when I'm going into the brain science of things. Another thing that I want to touch on that you brought up too was kind of this comparing of the victimhood. And I'm so glad you touched on that, because trauma really does put people in a place of comparing themselves to other people who have also had traumatic experiences. And sometimes it might be my trauma's worse, or sometimes it might be someone else has always had it worse than I have. And when someone brings something to me like that, I like to ask them this question: what is the difference between someone who drowns in 2 inches of water and someone who drowns in 5 feet of water?
Brilliant. Very good.
It's all subjective, right? What's traumatic for me might not be traumatic for you, and I may have more traumatic experiences, but ultimately those impacts come down to so many different dimensions of trauma, you know, our individual personalities, the environment, what was the context that this occurred in. So there can be so many different things that can impact how deeply a trauma can really affect someone in their brain. So the next part I want to touch on too, before I dive into what really works, is this fundamental understanding of how trauma actually impacts the brain. So when I teach people about this, I love Dan Siegel's hand brain because you can take it anywhere with you. It's like right there with you, my handy dandy hand brain. So
just readers should know that she's just holding up her fist.
Yes. And I'll describe the part. So if you were to hold up your arm and you were to touch the forearm, that's actually going to represent your spinal cord.
Right.
Then if you were to touch the palm of your hand, that's actually going to be your brainstem, responsible for all those things you don't want to think about, like your heart rate, blood pressure, breathing. And then if you fold your thumb in on top of your palm,
that's great.
Yeah, that's actually the limbic system.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And then we take those fingers and we fold those down on top of that thumb that's now inside of the palm, and that's going to be our cortex. And when we're teaching people about the brain, we're really trying to simplify things. We don't want to make anyone feel like we're talking down to them. So I even simplify that further into upstairs brain, downstairs brain. Here's the thing. Upstairs brain is the only part of the brain that we get to control with our conscious thoughts. Everything else is beyond conscious control. Those are those survival centers. Trauma, addiction, they change the downstairs brain. They change that limbic system and that midbrain. So when we think about what works, we have to understand what area of the brain has been impacted by this particular situation. And in this case, it is the downstairs brain. So traditional talk therapies, they are helpful. You definitely need things like CBT to help people begin to shift their perspectives, positive self-talk, all of those good things. But you also need interventions that are going to work with that downstairs brain. And for me, the one thing that changed the way that I have done trauma work completely was being trained and certified in EMDR. So for those who might not know what that is, it's eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing.
I'm doing it while she says it because I always think, I should do that more, and I never do. So yeah. I'll probably make you dizzy by doing it. Okay.
But it's so neat because when I began to understand how EMDR actually works in the brain to facilitate change, to facilitate healing, and I'm able to explain that to people, I find that they're more open to trying something that's a little bit outside the comfort zone.
Good. So why don't you explain it first in case a person doesn't know what it is and then why it works?
Yes. So EMDR would look a little something like this. You might come into session for me and say, I was in a really bad car accident. So what we would then do is we would move into the first phase of EMDR, which would be taking all of your history, figuring out how that car accident has impacted you, what are the symptoms you're experiencing, are you having nightmares, flashbacks, all that good stuff. Then we would move into a place of resourcing. Because when we're going to do trauma work, we want to make sure people know how to get themselves in the window of tolerance. And I'm not sure if that's a concept that people are familiar with, but it's this basic idea that we all have an energy level that we feel comfortable with. But sometimes we get outside that window and we're either so hyped up that we don't know how to calm down, or we're so low that we can't even get out of bed. So the point there is to teach people really simple skills that can help them spend more time in that window of tolerance. The biggest thing for me and the most life-changing for the clients that I serve is simple belly breathing. I cannot tell you how far that goes for a lot of my clients. So doing the resourcing phase, then we would move into really getting a better understanding of that trauma, not just what that trauma was, but what emotions it elicits and where do you feel it in the body. And that's the key right there, that we identify the emotion and the body sensation, because we know trauma is stored in our bodies as well as in our brains. So the next part would be to do processing. And processing might involve eye movements. So someone following my fingers as I'm tracking them left and right. And that's going to create what we call bilateral stimulation, which is activation of the left and right hemispheres of the brain. It may be tapping, right? So I might tap left and right on their knees. They may tap for themselves. It can even be tones. So they may put earbuds in and the earbuds would go back and forth, left, right, left, right, left, right.
And by the way, people should know there are also resources on YouTube that does this. It's sort of as if you had a ping pong ball that was bouncing from one side to another and you were watching it with your eyes.
Yes.
There's a few of them on YouTube. Yeah.
And they're even
and
really
just you would search on EMDR, which stands for eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
Yeah.
what does it do? What is it doing?
So it actually moves you through the stages of what we would call positive trauma resolution. That's re-experience,
Are you
reorganize.
thinking about are you supposed to think about the trauma while you're watching the
Correct.
yes.
Correct. So that's the most important part, is that before I've started that bilateral stimulation, I actually have you think of an image, identify the emotions that you're feeling that are related to that image and that traumatic experience, and then notice where you're feeling it in your body. And then I would start that bilateral stimulation. So the eye movements, the tapping, or the tones. So what's happening in the brain as that's going on is we're actually stimulating our brain's natural ability to heal itself. We call that concept adaptive information processing. So like, think about it. When you get a paper cut, right, the blood clots, you get a scab, it heals perfectly fine. And the same thing with the brain. If you get an F on a test, you're probably going to be okay. But if you were to cut your hand with a jigsaw, I really hope you're going to go to the doctor, because that's probably not going to heal so well on its own. Same thing can be said with the brain. If you have a serious car accident that was really frightening, maybe you got injured, lost someone you love, the brain may not be able to get over that on its own. And so when we do EMDR, we're actually stimulating that brain's natural ability to heal itself by not just activating the upstairs brain, but also the downstairs brain.
Great. Oh, that's such a good idea. Well, I like that so much, and our time is limited, so why don't we just move on to another one of your interventions so people just understand that there are some variety of solutions.
Of course, yes. So another one I like to share about would be mindfulness. And I kind of touched on that a little before when I was talking about the diaphragmatic breathing. And I think when we think about working with mindfulness and trauma, we need to be aware that a bored brain might bring up painful images or sensations. So with mindfulness, we need to be really careful about how we help our clients step into this. So I start with basic belly breathing. So really just having them put their hand on their tummy, notice their tummy fill with air, exhaling slowly. And this is actually going to do something really cool in the brain. So we have that survival center, right? And our nervous system is made up of this fight or flight, or this relax and digest. Well, the cool thing about it is if you get in that fight or flight and you breathe at a rate of 6 breaths per minute, which is that really slow belly breathing, you will switch yourself out of fight or flight and back into the relax and digest part of the brain. So that's a really powerful way to introduce mindfulness. Now, it can kind of work its way up, right? From basic belly breathing and just focusing on the breath to a guided body scan, or up to something like Dan Siegel's Wheel of Awareness meditation, which I really personally enjoy. And Dan Siegel has tons of free resources on his website and even recordings of the Wheel of Awareness for anyone who'd be interested in trying it. But he kind of gave us a caution that this is something you'd want to do in a therapeutic space with a therapist so that you can be supported if anything troublesome comes up. But what we're doing there is we're using a 3-pillar practice where there's open awareness, kind intention, and then focused attention. And then what we're able to do with the brain is promote neural integration. So we know that like traumatic experiences actually impair our brain's ability to integrate, like have differentiated parts that can communicate with each other. So that has serious implications for our basic ability to function, even just doing something that requires more than one step or socially attuning to somebody.
That's great. Very good. Very good. And that's that concept I'm just going to repeat about integration. So it's your brain has different skills, but in every moment of every day, you may be using more than one at the same time. Like a simple example would be my urge to talk and my urge to shut up and stay out of trouble. So you're basically activating different modules of your skill. And you can just believe in your own ability to do that. One really brilliant metaphor I learned from Steven Pinker, and I can't remember if he got it from someone else, but he calls it the Swiss Army knife view of the brain. Like that your brain is just a bunch of different tools. Yes. And you pull out the tool that's available. And I mean, the tool that's appropriate. And many people have this urge for like, I want to take over the control center and fix it. And that's not really, doesn't work. It's just better off to just think, you know, I have a bunch of tools and I'm going to enjoy the power of my tools and maybe sometimes build a new tool.
Yes, yes. And we know that when we do build those new tools, they can end up being a replacement for some of those maybe old tools that weren't really serving us in the right way. I like to think about that concept when I think about working with addiction, because we know that, like there was that old idea, like you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but when you see inside the brain, you realize nothing could be further from the truth. We have the power of neurogenesis. We can literally form new neurons. We have neuroplasticity, which is awesome with addiction and trauma because it means we can change parts of the brain that have already been changed. And then we also have the fact that if you don't use a network over time, you're going to lose it. So I think that's the importance of, repetition in counseling. And when you're trying to, and you touch on this a lot in your work, you have to repeat this behavior in order for it to build those connections, to build that network, so that when something bad happens, you're not just going to that old familiar tool that may actually be hurting you and hurting the ones you love.
Yes, great. So we can talk in a minute about a person who, let's say, is stuck. But first, any more interventions or tools that you'd like to suggest?
Yes. So one that I am super excited about, I actually just got to take a training from a fabulous woman. Her name's Bette Lamont, and she was training us on a intervention called neurological reorganization. And what this is actually capable of doing is reshaping lower brain structures. So not the thinking brain, but parts of the downstairs brain in the brainstem. And the cool concept that I took away from that training was you can think of the brain kind of like a fan. So like the bottom of the fan would be like the brainstem, and then you'd move up and the center of the fan would represent that limbic system. But then the top, the largest part of that is the cortex.
That's great.
So, yes. And if there's something going on, let's say there was a dot down here in that base of that fan, if you then kind of plot out what the impacts are, they are so far reaching because it doesn't just stop there in that brainstem. It impacts the next layer of development and then the next layer of development, which is how we can have people who are highly intelligent but cannot read a sentence in a book because there was some sort of missed developmental milestone. There was something that did not happen or did not occur in that first 36 months of life where we're really developing the foundation for those higher brain structures. And the cool thing that I took away from that was it's really movement, simple movements babies do, like crawling on our tummy and creeping on all fours. And then rich sensory experiences, which are important in reshaping those super low brain structures.
Yeah, very good. So, and I encourage anyone to contact April if you want to learn more about this. Now, I was going to go on, but you're such a good resource. So do you have any other resources that you want to suggest?
I'm trying to think.
If not, we can, go on to another subject.
I mean, there are tons of different things out there. I think one of the most important things that I teach people in the work that I do is the difference between coping and regulation. So coping skills, they're super important. We all need coping skills, the thing that makes us feel better when we're not feeling so good. But I feel like if we're just teaching people how to cope, we're selling them a little short because what we really should be teaching them to do is regulate. Right? So regulation is taking that one step further, which is I don't just do something to make myself look good when I feel bad. I do something every day. In fact, multiple things every day to take care of my mind, my body, my emotions, and my relationships. I think that's one of the biggest things that people miss when they think about self-care. Like we were talking earlier about how we're hardwired for survival. And I love that you take the mammal brain perspective because if you think about it, we're hardwired for connection because we're hardwired for survival. We're mammals. If you watch mammals in nature, if you're not with the herd, you don't have the safety of the herd. You don't have access to the resources of the herd. So social engagement, having mutual relationships and taking care of them is very much a part of regulation and taking care of ourselves.
Good. So now we can move on to this what to do if a person is stuck. What can a person do if they feel like, well, I've tried everything and nothing works because I have trauma. And in my opinion, first, when you, like, for example, when you talk about needing a herd, people have an idealized sense of a herd. When you talk about regulation, people have an idealized sense of regulation. So in my opinion, people are always idealizing how the brain should be. And then they're saying, well, I can't have that because of something that went wrong in my past. And therefore, I'm shortchanged, I'm left out, and bottom line, I need special treatment. And this is, in a way, a coping skill that gets rewarded in our world. And our brain is always learning from what gets rewarded. And so if you get rewarded for having a trauma identity, then you may not have sort of given yourself permission to try other steps, because then you'd lose your trauma identity, and then you don't know what you'd get in exchange, and you have to do all that yucky stuff that you're scared of. And so I think a lot of people just sort of end up in a place of what I call bitterness. And that's what my book, Science of Positivity, is about, that sort of bitterness of like, well, I'm stuck in this negative place and I don't have a choice. So I'd love to hear what you think about that and what you'd tell a person in that situation.
Yes. So I think one of the things that was helpful for me was getting a model of, human functioning that comes from like truly a place of compassion. So when I look at someone who's not functioning well, who's failing at something, the assumption that I make is that they're not failing at it because they don't want to be good at it, but rather that they lack a certain area of skill in order to be accomplishing what they're wanting to accomplish. And so if we look at it from that perspective, then we do see that there is hope, because we can always learn new skills if we can figure out and identify what those areas are. So I think that's kind of the first thing to kind of address, that trauma identity that can sometimes happen, and, where people struggle and how we can view that struggle and how we can help them to develop self-compassion about where they're at with things.
So wait, just to reiterate what you said. So it went by really fast, but I think you said something about accomplishing. So it's helping a person identify what they want to accomplish, because that's their motivation to try something different. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think that's definitely an important part of it. I think what I was trying to say was that, like, we need to help people who've experienced trauma, and we as people who work with people who've experienced trauma should try to come from a perspective that if someone is not winning, if someone is not, achieving what they're trying to achieve, if they're experiencing a lot of failure, that it's not because they want that to be happening, but rather because they lack the skills to be able to do those things. And then taking that perspective allows us to help them in identifying what are the skills that you do need. Maybe those are social skills. Maybe those are just basic life skills. But what are those areas where we can teach you and help you to learn different strategies for working toward meeting your own needs? And part of that is kind of moving from like what you would call the trauma triangle. My mentor, Mary Vicario, taught me about this. When you're on the trauma triangle, you're stuck in this place of perpetrator, victim, rescuer. And so in therapy, we can sometimes end up on that trauma triangle with our clients. What we want to do is try to back away from that and move to more of an empowerment triangle, where instead of being a perpetrator, we're a challenger, right? We're challenging them to, work toward meeting their own needs. We're inviting them, right? We're inviting them to try new things. And it's all about choice when working with people who've experienced trauma, because that is what trauma is, that loss of power and that sense of control. And when really things get very overwhelming. So you want to be a challenger, you want to be an inviter, and you want to be a coach. And in that way, we can kind of help people get off that trauma triangle where they feel really stuck and help them start to feel really empowered.
Good. So just to repeat about this trauma triangle, I've also heard it referred to as the drama triangle, and also the rescue triangle.
Yeah.
So the idea is that there are three roles, and one role is I'm the victim, one role is I'm the perpetrator, and one role is I'm the rescuer. And the
Mhm.
bottom line of this triangle is not that there's the better role. The bottom line is that you don't need to be on the triangle. And that once a person has been in this drama pattern, they think, well, I don't want to be a victim. So my only other choices are to be a rescuer or a perpetrator. And what would it mean to not be any of them and to just not have that triangle being the script for your life, but just to have some other script? Well, that's hard because people use the circuits they have, and it's such a deep and basic fundamental circuit of your brain that you just keep going back to it. And society reinforces it in a way because that's a mode of mass communications, and so many people are on the drama triangle. So it's just the idea of, like, you don't have to pattern the world or structure the world in that way, right?
Yes. And this is where like the breakthrough happened for me. And I think your work was really a part of that, was like, we end up on autopilot because those pathways that we build when we're younger are myelinated. So they work a lot faster and they're like the brain's superhighways. It's so easy just to like sit and be on autopilot. And then we're going through life. And then we're like, why do I keep making decisions that aren't lining up with my values? You know, why am I in this place where I can't meet my goals? And it's because we're on autopilot. When you get intentional, it's hard because you have to be like on top of it 24/7.
Yeah.
But that's where change happens, is when you're being intentional about, like you said, taking those small steps outside the comfort zone. And I think that's one thing that I've taken to telling people when we begin working together, is that I cannot promise you this is going to feel good, right? That there are probably going to be some distressing moments, but what I can promise you is that I'm going to be here to support you when that happens, and that I'm going to do my best to teach you the tools to manage that. Because part of this work too is helping the people that we work with come to an acceptance that life is not always rainbows and butterflies. And to expect that it is going to be is not only it's just setting us up for failure. So we have to learn how to manage those difficult periods and how to take care of ourselves on a regular basis, regardless of what's happening, so that when those bad things happen, we have a much calmer central nervous system and we can control our response.
Good. So let's do a hypothetical example. And first I want to mention that a person can't be intentional 24 hours a day, or, all your waking hours, because our brain is designed to use the old neural pathways. So what I focus on, I think of it as like a highway and an exit ramp. So when you have a frustrating situation and you're just about to drive on the highway of repeating that old trauma circuit, that you can find the exit ramp and take a different road. So you have to build the other road first. You have to build the exit ramp first. And that's what's hard, and that takes a lot of intentionality. But then the more built it is, the easier it is to flow in that new direction. So let's think of a real life example. And what I'm thinking of is, let's say that a person is in a bad situation with somebody, like their living space, their work life, or their dating life, and they have to take a new step into trying something new. So I'm making a phone call or emails to contact a new landlord, a new employer, a new possible dating prospect. And they think about what to write, and they start panicking as soon as they think about what to write, and they think of every hurt that they've ever experienced. And that's how the brain works, because that path is so big that your electricity just flows there. But you use your intentionality and you say, oh, that's just my old pathway turning on. What new pathway can I build? Oh, I know. I can get what I want by taking steps. And I can't guarantee that my first step will work, but if I keep taking steps, I can have a better life. So I do it. I work real hard. I take that first step. I write an email, and then I get a reply. And this person gets this reply, and they get all upset about the reply, and they say, oh no, everybody's against me. The world is terrible, because this reply is either, let's say the reply is just auto-generated and they're insulted. Or let's say the reply is a flat, no, we don't need any right now. Or let's say the reply is a maybe. Or let's say the reply is a yes, and then you panic that they're going to hate you once you get the yes, because now you have to talk to them in person. So do you want to say something to this person in this hypothetical situation?
Well, I think what I would want them to do is, become aware of the feeling, not try to avoid it, because I think we have a huge problem in our culture with totally avoiding our emotions. And emotions and sensations are there. They're our brain and body's way of communicating with us. So I think it's important that we allow ourselves to have that experience, to become aware of it, but also to not over-identify with it. And a good way to keep ourselves from doing that would be to use one of those simple interventions, like just doing some belly breathing, kind of helping your system calm back down. And then I would also suggest that they do some sort of social engagement. So maybe they call a friend, right? Because from the minute we enter this world, like the minute we come out of our mommy's tummies, we're regulating through our relationships with other people, right? When we're a baby and we're distressed, we cry, and hopefully our mommy comes to us and she rocks us and she coos and we settle down. And the same thing happens as we grow through life. I still call my dad when I have a bad day. And it helps me to regulate. We know that mutual interactions have 4 effects on the brain. And this is the work of Amy Banks and relational neuroscience. So the first is that a mutual relationship has a calming effect on the brain. The second is that when we're in a mutual relationship, we feel accepted. And then the third is that we feel like we're resonating. So we feel like that other person has an understanding of our internal experience. And the fourth impact is that it's energizing. So if we're feeling disrupted, I think we have to be present with that emotion and then also move towards something that can help our system kind of manage that feeling so that it's not so overwhelming. And a lot of times that's inner regulation, so like the belly breathing, and then also co-regulation, so calling a friend or calling a loved one.
Okay, good. I'm going to also offer my own ideas about this situation.
Yes,
so,
and I love the metaphor you used too. That was like a whole new level for me of kind of thinking about we have to build the road first, and then we have to build the exit ramp that connects that.
Yeah.
And that's integration. So when I have a client with a good resource too, I do a little bit of bilateral stimulation, just that left-right really slowly, and that promotes integration of that new resource. So just wanted to throw that tidbit in there. It's like connecting the exit ramp to the road. I was like,
yeah. Thank you. Yeah, the exit ramp is in my new book, Tame Your Anxiety, which is coming out in May.
I love
yeah, and it grew from a real life experience where I would really, like, I moved to a new house and I kept automatically taking the old road. And I realized that as long as I was in the lane near it, the only way I could avoid the old road is if I thought of it that split second. And then the consequences are so terrible, you can't leave it all to that split second. So you have to do something in advance, which is sort of like the cliche of like a person not having junk food in the house. But yeah, so that's because you can't trust yourself in that 1 second. So again, the topic is if a person is trying something new and they're getting bad feelings about it, and that activates their old circuit. So some ideas. So what I mentioned is you take that first step and you're so proud of yourself, but that gets you to step 2, and then all your bad feelings flood back when you're on step 2. So what else can you do? So again, the idea is that you're in new territory because you haven't gotten this far before. So you don't know what else to do, and you don't have a familiar neural pathway that says how to deal with someone that you want something from. And your past experience is telling you that that person is going to be bad to you, when the reality is that there are many people who are not bad, but they're going about their own life. And you can't just expect them to drop their whole life in order to meet your needs. So you have to be in sort of a negotiation with this person. And it's a respectful, mutual negotiation with that person. And you may not have an automatic neural pathway for that kind of negotiation. You may be from one extreme of either getting upset or just completely withdrawing. So you're really asking your inner mammal to do something you haven't done before. It's almost like if you think of an animal that's either attacks or crawls in a hole and runs away, what would be something in between would be like maybe taking slow, careful steps toward the new possible resource. And sometimes it won't work, and then you have to start over and take slow, careful steps toward another possible new resource. Now, I just want to mention a couple things you said that don't work for me, but you know, we all have our own things. So you mentioned that in our culture, we don't always acknowledge our feelings. And I just want to mention that our culture is not the problem, in my opinion, that many people are taught automatically to blame our culture. And I learned that in school too. It has become like an automatic thing. It's always America's fault, Western culture's fault, as if there's some other culture where people are effortlessly happy and get along all the time. And it's absolutely not true. I spent a lot of time in other cultures because I had this illusion, oh, if I can only, you know, connect with one of these good cultures and I can be effortlessly happy all the time. Well, why is it not happening? People in those cultures are trying to come here. So this is a brain thing that is universal and not, and if you just blame our culture, it sort of makes it like a fast, easy blame thing.
Can I interject?
Yeah.
I just want to correct. I didn't mean to
Yeah.
blame society as a whole. I'm saying that our culture has an influence because we
Yeah.
live in a society of immediate gratification, where when we don't like the way we're feeling, we want to do something really quickly.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Instead of
Yeah.
allowing ourselves to experience.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
I think it's
yeah.
always true, you know, that we have to look at, you know, we're responsible for our influence. We're not responsible for what people do with our influence. So I'd say the same thing about culture. It has an influence, and then people do things with that influence.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. So the culture says, so let's just imagine, to just put it in the positive, imagine a culture that said, I'm in a bad mood right now. I don't have to make it go away immediately. Okay. So, but again, it's not just the culture, but it's also your inner mammal that says, when I'm in a bad mood, that's cortisol. Cortisol tells me I'm going to die if I don't make it go away. So there's this urge to make it go away that you learned when you were young. If I eat a whole box of cookies to make it go away, that's good for me, because your inner mammal thinks that making it go away means escaping a lion. So it's that you have to retrain your inner mammal to say, if I feel bad for a few minutes, it's just a chemical, and my body will process and eliminate that chemical in an hour. And within that hour, I'm not going to do anything important, because then I'll just do something important with like a negative attitude that will put a worse case on it. So I'm just going to do something rewarding, like what I talk about is something that uses your mind and body together. This is to tame your anxiety. So one other thing about calling a friend. So I have a few limitations, and I'm not against calling a friend, and I understand all the valuable reasons for it. But a person might say, oh, well, that's the problem, is I don't have a friend like that. I don't have a parent like that. It's not my fault. Other people are not good to me, and it doesn't work. So just want to mention some other things on the other side of that. Nobody is ever going to understand you perfectly, because everybody has their brain designed by their specific life experiences. So often the only way we really connect with other people is when there's a common enemy. So if you could call a friend because you're upset about your spouse or your boss, and you talk to this friend and your friend says, yeah, your spouse is a jerk, your boss is a jerk, this one's a jerk, then this bonding around a common enemy is not really good for you. It's just reinforcing that victim perspective. So I just want to suggest some possible alternatives. So one alternative is if I go and give my husband a hug and I try to tell him the whole story and he doesn't get it, and then I get all upset that he doesn't get it. And then if I call my friends and then they won't get it, or they'll tell me my husband is a jerk. So again, my problem, what upset me, is so specific that it's not always realistic to expect other people to get it. And sometimes I have to say that what upsets me, it's hard to even figure out. It's like you don't even get, why did I get so upset over that? And I'll give you an example that almost everyone can relate to. Let's say I have some job where someone says, go to this form and fill this out, and then you could be part of our whatever. And you go and you fill out the form and nothing goes right. Everything goes wrong. And you think this is going to be a 5-minute task, and it's like torture. And like an hour later, you still haven't figured out this form. And I get so upset when these kind of things happen. And so what happens to me a lot when I get really upset over some minute, stupid task that I can't do, I make some horrible animal noise. And my husband hears the animal noise and he comes running like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And I tell him the whole story and he doesn't get it. But while I'm telling him, I suddenly figure out the answer. And that helped me realize that the other person doesn't necessarily have to have the answer. It's the act of explaining it to another person that sometimes helps you see it, because of just what you were saying is about we have different parts of our mind, and sort of making the connections between them is hard because your animal brain is nonverbal. And by putting your problem into words, it helps you sort of activate the different circuits at the same time. And the electricity is now finding its way between these different activated centers because you've activated them all at the same time by talking. So sometimes what the other person is giving you is just, this has become a cliche now, but just listening. But what I find is if you tell a person the whole story and then they don't really get it, then it's sort of frustrating. And then you feel like they give you advice and you don't agree with their advice, but then you have to be nice to them and go along with their advice. So I've come up with this thing that I call the rubber ducky method, which is you just get a rubber ducky and you put it on your desk and you tell the rubber ducky the problem. Just a possibility. And I have to say that I did not invent this, but I got this from computer programmers who call it the rubber ducky debugging method.
Okay.
And you can look it up. It's on Wikipedia and everything. And the idea is that when a high-tech programmer has a bug and they can't find it and they're all frustrated and they tell the problem to a rubber ducky, and within a few minutes they have the solution, because it's really the verbal brain that helps you activate this stuff. And once again, it is nice to call a friend and it is nice to get a hug. But again, I find that sometimes I'm working so hard to accommodate that other person's view of the situation that I'm not really getting to the bottom of my own situation. And also, like I said, I'm embarrassed with my husband that I'm screaming and groaning over this problem. And then as soon as I tell it to him, I suddenly figure out the solution that works for me. And so then I'm embarrassed to have bothered him. So now I say to him, would you mind being my rubber ducky? And then I can be his rubber ducky sometimes.
Okay. So kind of, which I would say that's a good way to approach it too. I've had that conversation with people before when they're concerned about how something is going to go is that it's okay before you have a conversation with someone to kind of share with them how you might like them to respond, if you want them to respond at all. So kind of that idea of listen versus fix. Like, I don't really need you to fix this for me. Kind of just need you to listen, try to understand what this must be like for me to experience that. And
But deep down inside, I want somebody to have the answer for me. And because I don't have the answer and I feel threatened by not having the answer. And then for years I thought, what's wrong with my life? Why don't I know anybody who has the right answers? And then I thought, oh, duh, that's my inner child who wants an all-knowing parent. And some people address that with a belief in a supreme being. And other people address it with cynicism and anger. Nobody helps me, nobody cares. But what would be an adult way of addressing it is to say that it's natural and healthy to want someone who has all the answers. But in real life, if I found my guru, then I'd be frustrated that they were limiting me, because I am having the joy of my next step and the joy of choosing and navigating my own path, rather than just being having a guru and following them. And that's something I've given myself. Not everybody wants that, but then I have to just not beat up on myself for not having somebody to solve all my problems, but to say that I can give myself the gift of having the confidence in solving this problem. And that starts with just putting it into words and saying, wow, I have a problem. Right now, I don't know the solution. I'm going to take a few minutes to try different solutions, and it may take me some time. And that's so freeing to not think there's something wrong with me for not having the solution to the problem.
Yes, definitely. I love that. You had mentioned too that movement is another good way to kind of manage something like that. Could you tell, like, what would you suggest kind of specifically for that piece?
So one thing I talk about, and again, this is in Tame Your Anxiety, is moving your body and your mind together. Because the cliche of just going on a bicycle or walking in the park, that if you're doing that and while you're doing it, you're reviewing all your arguments of how mad you are on this person and how nobody is ever good to you, then you're not really clearing the slate, which is physical electricity that's activating the nobody loves me circuit and everybody's bad to me circuit and everybody's a jerk circuit. So you have to really clear the slate, and that's both letting the electricity flow out of those circuits and into some other circuit, and then giving yourself 20 to 40 minutes for your body to excrete the cortisol. So what can you do for 20 to 40 minutes that activates both your mind and your body, and you like it? So it's not the time to do that thing on your to-do list that you hate, but something that you like. And so in my book, Tame Your Anxiety, I give not only a bunch of suggestions, but also suggestions of a way to sort of make them portable. So if you're not at home, you can also do them. But again, they can be exercise that also busies your mind at the same time, or it could be sort of a craft that keeps your hands busy while you're making something. Or
maybe like a puzzle or something like that, or a board game or Twister.
Yeah. And again, with Twister, it's great if you have other people around, but you always have a backup plan so that you don't say, it's not my fault, I'm in a funk, but they didn't want to play Twister with me.
Right.
And in my case, I have to tell you that I have some recordings that I listen to, and I go chop onions because I know it's not totally fun, but it's keeping my hands busy, but I feel like I'm getting something done. I'm getting dinner made, and I will save that for if I have a really hard job that I hate to do, and then I say, after this job, I'm going to take a break. And I'm going to do one of these mind-body activities, cook dinner, but I'm also going to keep my mind busy. And then while I'm doing the activity that I hate, I know that I'm going to get a break after. So any cortisol that I've generated, I know that I'm going to relieve it. So I don't worry about going into a spiral of, oh, if this person hates what I'm doing, and then I'm going to go into a spiral of everybody hates what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's powerful too. It kind of reminded me of another one too, even just like thinking about a resource, you know, like when you are kind of stuck in a situation where you can't actually do the thing, a lot of the research is saying that if we can even imagine ourselves doing it in as much detail as possible, that our brain will respond in a way that we are. So if I'm stuck in the office and I'm feeling stressed out, imagining myself hiking in the forest and taking note of what I can see and smell and hear and feel in that particular scenario.
Yeah, great. And just to give you an idea of where some of this comes from, people who are doing performance research in sports, athletics, have disseminated a lot of this. And I had a tennis teacher who would say that when he was at a stoplight, he would, work on his tennis swing. And it's so good because, as you know, being stopped at a light, I don't know why, but so many people go into that negative spiral when they're stopped at a light, which is partly just because those background circuits, that's where you go when you don't keep your mind busy, and partly because being in a red light is sort of that iconic situation of, I have no control and other people are getting ahead of me, So it's really good to have other ways to keep your mind active. Well, anyway, Libby, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. And do you have any final words or thoughts or insights?
I think I might like to end with a quote. And before I do, I just want to say thank you so much again for inviting me to be a part of your podcast today. It's been so much fun just learning from you. I mean, I really just appreciate your work and all the resources that you share. So the kind of final thought that I would have, and this is a quote from Emily McDowell. It says, "Finding yourself is not really how it works. You aren't a $10 bill in last winter's coat pocket. You're also not lost. Your true self is right there, buried under cultural conditioning, other people's opinions, and inaccurate conclusions you drew as a kid that became your beliefs about who you are. Finding yourself is actually returning to yourself, an unlearning, an excavation, a remembering who you were before the world got its hands on you."
Great. Thank you so much. That's fabulous. And I just want to ask, do you remember how you first found my work?
On Facebook, actually. And I remember one of the first and one of the most powerful things when you shared about the endorphins and how we get endorphins when we have a physical injury, but the brain does not release endorphins when we experience a social injury. And since then, I have been sharing that with everyone I know because it totally connects with spot theory and all that other great work. So thank you so much.
Do you remember how you found that Facebook post, though?
I am not sure. It might have just popped up in kind of the suggested things because I tend to follow like trauma and brain science pages on Facebook.
Okay. Oh, great, great. Well, thank you once again. Keep in touch.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.